Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. Today we're going to continue our book club series by taking a look at Out of the Mountains, The Coming Age of the Urban Guerrilla by David Kilcullen. Today I'm going to have to stick with the audio-only format because my desk is a little bit cluttered at the moment from some of the projects I'm working on, so we'll just make the best of it and discuss some of the themes from the book. Now, for those of you who actually made it through this book, congratulations. This is not exactly an easy feat. Reading Kilcullen is not really something that most people are fond of doing. Kilcullen is one of those authors where the titles sound really great, the covers of the books look really awesome, and they're really great if you want your picture taken reading a book, so that you can look a lot smarter than you actually are. But once you read it, once you get into the book, it is exceptionally frustrating. And that's not to put Kilcullen down or anything like that. After all, he's one of the most influential policymakers of the past 40 years or so. Make of that what you will. But just right up front, it's not a challenging read if you're looking to get into something like this. Fortunately, the ideas contained within are very, very simple. But first, let's talk a little bit about the author. Like I mentioned, David Kilcullen is a very influential writer in the counterinsurgency space. He was really one of the driving factors behind one of the earlier theories from a few years ago called basically the small wars theory, or the low-intensity conflict model of warfare. And to summarize that very briefly, basically as the generations of warfare transitioned, right, the first gen, second gen, third gen, and finally moved into more of a fourth generation model, counterinsurgency, right? As that sort of theory started to develop, we had experiences like the tail end of Korea, I guess you could say, definitely Vietnam for sure, and sort of the Iraq wars in some regards, sort of coming to a crescendo with the occupation of Iraq and the insurgency that resulted from that, and of course, not to forget basically the entirety of the Afghan war. From about the year 2000, 2001, around 9/11, right up until about, I don't know, maybe 2015, 2013, something like that. One of the bigger doctrine pushes, the hot new topic, was this small wars theory, this low intensity conflict. Basically that a lot of doctrine writers were saying, look, hey, the days of Rommel driving his tanks through the desert and driving tanks through the French countryside, that's not going to happen anymore. We're not going to have any more D-Days. We're not going to have any more large market garden amphibious or airborne operations. We're not going to do things like we used to in the past. The fiascos in Vietnam kind of showed us that, look, hey, we're not going to be fighting along a front line so much anymore. We're going to be fighting smaller, lower intensity conflicts, basically proxy wars. Proxy wars are going to be the new thing. We're going to be supporting the Kurds in northern Iraq as long as it's convenient. We're going to be supporting the separatist groups in Syria as long as they're taking the fight to Assad. We're going to be fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan until it becomes rapidly apparent that ISIS are the worst kids on the block, so we're going to start taking out ISIS for the Taliban. But we see how Kilcullen is right center stage for a lot of this line of thinking. Now, if I were to tell you this description a few years ago, I'm sure a lot of heads would nod around the room that small wars, insurgencies, proxy wars, things that are not going to involve B-52s, things that are going to involve really just a team of advisors. This seems an awful lot like the way warfare is going. If I'm seated in a nice mahogany conference room or seated in a nice auditorium listening to some guy in a suit and tie talk about how warfare is going to go, this makes an awful lot of sense. So that's the perspective that we have to come at this book from, because this book was published in 2013, right at the absolute peak of counterinsurgency thinking and small wars and low-intensity conflict kind of thing. So you must remember that when I lay some criticism on Kilcullen and his peers, I'm also laying it on myself to some degree, because that's what everyone was thinking along those lines at that time. Now, the very next year, something happened that caused a lot of us to change kind of our ways of thinking with regards to this small wars theory. Not that it's wrong, not that it's completely off base, but maybe we need to entertain the idea of doing something else. And that event was the 2014 invasion of Crimea. Now, a lot of people saw this coming at the time, but it was kind of the unspoken thing. You didn't really want to talk about it. This kind of shaped a lot of things moving forward, so we kind of got a taste in 2014 of what happened in 2022. So this is why a lot of us covered the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2022, because we saw it coming from 2014, years prior. It was absolutely within the playbook of what Russia was going to do. And unfortunately, it was also within the playbook of what NATO was going to do. But I guess we can talk about that another day. The reason that I wanted to bring this up and frame things this way is because Kilcullen's history, right? People are still reading his books. A lot of policymakers are still married to the idea of small wars. They're still married to the idea of low-intensity conflict and insurgencies and things like that, which you see in the NATO response to the Ukraine invasion in 2022, which was probably not the best way of looking at things. You have to remember, keeping the author in mind of this particular book, David Kilcullen was a senior advisor for General David Petraeus. He was also a very prominent advisor in a decently public role, serving under Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice at the time. So I'm sorry if some of those names bring back some really bad memories for some of you out there. But reading this book, Out of the Mountains, you can see the faces of the likes of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld on virtually every single page. So a somewhat unpleasant reminder of how the United States doctrine really didn't work so well in the early 2000s. Now, struggling to keep things relevant and on topic here, the book itself, Out of the Mountains, can really be summarized in just a few sentences. Kilcullen makes the argument in a few hundred pages that future conflicts are more likely to be low intensity and largely be fought in littoral or coastal, very, very poor, very impoverished, and population-dense urban centers or cities, right? And one of the major aspects of this sort of conflict is going to be what he calls competitive control of the local population. Some of us may know this term a little bit more clearly as hearts and minds. Basically that a non-state actor, an insurgent group, or a political movement of some kind, something that is not affiliated with a government, in a situation where there maybe isn't a government, is going to try to struggle to maintain positive control over a populace, their feelings, their thoughts, all of this occurring within a very densely populated city. Another aspect Kilcullen kind of brings into this, a little bit of seasoning on top of this, is the idea, and I think this is a good idea, the idea that a city is a functioning, living, biological organism. Basically that a city is not just a collection of streets and buildings, but it is an entire culture of it in and of itself. This means that the U.S. military can't just roll in like the place is Saigon and just, lock the place down. It's not going to work like that. The insurgent, for lack of a better term, is going to always possess the ability to influence the population in ways that an invading force can't, right? And because the invading force always handles things very, very poorly, this is not going to go very well for the invading force because they're going to end up recruiting more insurgents than they are going to be stopping simply by putting up roadblocks and things like that. Now, some of you out there may understand and are probably screaming about the fact that this is probably the most obvious conclusion that has ever hit military doctrine, and I would agree. Reading this book is mildly infuriating at times, most of the time, because the assumptions and the lessons learned, even in 2013, were learned about 10 years too late. So if Kilcullen had actually said this stuff in 2003, 2005, maybe, after it became very apparent, after the seizure of Baghdad, that things were not going so well and that we were slipping into this dangerous thing called an insurgency. If Kilcullen had said this stuff then, this would have made an awful lot of sense, and it probably would have done a lot of good. However, again, hindsight is 20/20, so we don't want to criticize him too much for thinking these things many years ago. The thing is that it may be obvious for us today, but in 2013, it was not obvious to the senior leadership of the military, and unfortunately, it should have been obvious about 10 years prior to that. So there's a little bit of, hey, you know what, don't rag on him too much, because we know this stuff now in 2024, but we didn't know this stuff in 2013. My argument is we should have known this stuff by 2013, because it was very obvious that this was not going well, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq in 2013. But anyway, that's just my own personal thought on that. This kind of leads into, again, I don't want to just be complaining about the book, but this does lead into one of the bigger lessons that I personally learned from this book, is that, look, don't read this book with the assumption that the information in it is correct. I mean, factually, fine. David Kilcullen is a great researcher, and you'd be really hard-pressed to find factual errors in his book. However, the stuff that's missing is completely ridiculous. Like, not once did Kilcullen ever, address the fact that, maybe we shouldn't be going to war in these places in the first place, and maybe the CIA started this war in the first place. So all of these nice little cute terms like hybrid threats and contingent actors and bending the curve and operational continuity and environmental discontinuity. Yeah, I'm sure these terms sound really good if you're writing for Rand and you're trying to start the Vietnam War, but looking back, man, it's like, look, I'm just some dumb low-level analyst here, and pardon me for thinking that this high-level policy probably isn't the most effective. I'm just sitting here driving my keyboard, and I can tell you, you can say all these things, and you can even be right. It's just that, man, look, the spooks across the hall are going to cause you more problem than not, because, good grief, we're fighting ourselves half the time. Anyway. And that's kind of the biggest lesson that I got out of this book is that, look, reading this for factual accuracy and for this is how Doctrine is done is probably not the best way to read this book. Read this book, if you're going to read it from the perspective of this is what congressmen are reading, this is what senior defense analysts and senior defense officials are reading. This is the kind of stuff they're writing too. But this is the kind of thinking that they are doing, right, when they're planning wars. This book is about 15 years behind the curve, which is honestly on par for most military doctrine. Kilcullen is a little bit ahead of his time in that he actually is able to foresee, hey, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be leaning too much on this whole low-intensity conflict idea, because in typical defense fashion, rather than find a case study that supports their idea, Kilcullen at times in this book will find a case study that kind of disproves everything he's just said, but instead of saying, you know what, maybe we need to look at this a different way, he doubles down on his idea and says, no, really the data's wrong, and culture has no effect on any of this. So what this means for those of you who probably haven't read the book is that senior defense officials, right around the time of this book, right around the time of 2010, 2013, all the way up until 2019, were making a lot of really, really dumb decisions that some of us knew at the time was a dumb decisions, but because there were a lot of common sense thinkers that were not being listened to, and there was the military-industrial complex to feed, we could see literally in real time the U.S. military doctrine shifting to something nonsensical. And like I mentioned earlier, the 2014 invasion of Ukraine really pumped the brakes for a lot of us on this whole idea of small wars. We had so many papers being written. I can tell you there were so many papers being written on the instability of MAD and how Vladimir Putin is in control of nuclear weapons, and he just invaded another nation without using nuclear weapons, and we did not have a nuclear war, and yet nuclear weapons were supposed to prevent this kind of thing from happening, right? Mutually assured destruction. You launch nukes, I'm going to launch nukes as well. You invade Poland, I'm going to nuke you, and then we're all just going to, basically hold loaded revolvers to each other's heads, and that's going to be the kind of policy decision from, say, 1950 until, the early 90s or so. Well, 2014 comes around, and we've got little green men showing up in Ukraine and, the eastern areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk and places like that. Oh, and especially Crimea, little green men start showing up all over the place. Russian advisors or separatists, right? We all remember that confusion. But it's 2014, and remember, the United States is trying to gear up for 2016, political election year, and they're not really looking at things clearly, because most generals in 2014, and to this day, they're just politicians in uniform. They're not really looking at shaping policy for a military benefit. They're looking to shape policy for a financial benefit. So, Russia rolls tanks into Crimea and says, hey, this is ours now, and everybody freaks out for a little while, and a lot of papers get written, and everybody just kind of ignores it. It's one thing entirely to say, hey, look, we should not have invaded Afghanistan because we should have looked at what the Russians did in the 80s and realized they got their butt kicked in Afghanistan, and that these people are not the kind of people you want to mess with, man. This empire goes all the way back to to Alexander the Great. This is not something to be taken lightly. So it's one thing to not understand or learn from Russia's mistakes when we went into Afghanistan. However, it's an entirely different thing to look back and say, dude, you were a sergeant during the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. You're maybe a first sergeant now, and you've actually got a little bit of taste of command, and you're still making stupid mistakes. In 2024, after Ukraine has been invaded for a couple of years, and you're not changing hardly anything. So that's probably the biggest thing to come out of this book is just a very, very sharp and very clearly outlined and highlighted flashing neon sign of we need to not be behind the times by 15 years like we have been in the past. Everybody and their cousin in 2013 listened to Kilcullen, and what did we have? We had the U.S. Marine Corps removing main battle tanks from their armament. We had everybody in the Army scaling back airborne operations and going to the Afghanistan model, which is what? Helicopter assault force, landing Chinooks and Blackhawks at some podunk village in the middle of nowhere, and just going with that kind of thing for a while. We're not planning to drop hundreds of airborne dudes out of the backs of C-130s or anything else over, open fields in Europe or so. Well, guess what's actually happening? What did Russia do? Look, Russia has launched some of the largest airborne operations in history in Ukraine, and, a lot of airborne guys were paying a lot of attention to that, but, military leadership wasn't really thinking too much. It's only, after a couple of years, after Ukraine has basically lost this war, and NATO has lost this war, that we realize, oh boy, maybe we should have, kept some stuff going, Maybe we should have maintained those airfields in the South Pacific because of what's going on in China right now. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at things, and this book is definitely highlighting that, because in 2013, if the U.S. military and senior defense officials are thinking in terms of, well, counterinsurgency is kind of an important thing, bro, you are a decade behind the times, because you were getting spanked in Iraq and Afghanistan for about a decade, and that's how long it took for you to learn this lesson. Now, the guys on the ground, the soldiers on the ground realized it, but unfortunately, soldiers on the ground, even, I would say, probably even one-star generals, don't really have that much influence over national level policy. So again, for Kilcullen to write this book and everything in it in 2013, 2010, 2013 era, and say these things, it's like, well, no, duh. I mean, so that's why it's kind of, interesting to read this book and think, okay, it took the U.S. government 10 to 15 years to realize that counterinsurgencies are kind of important. And the whole idea, bringing it back to Kilcullen's thesis of conflicts being in, coastal, networked, and overwhelmingly urban cities, did this really play out? One of the more sinister interpretations of this book, which I don't disagree with, is that this is the line of thinking that's going to be used here at home. And that's kind of the reading between the lines kind of thing that you have to do is, look, the U.S. military, the U.S. defense industry, the military-industrial complex is preparing and has prepared for a counterinsurgency. They developed an awful lot of technology in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, and that doctrine has got a home to go to. It's going to have to be used somewhere to justify its existence, and here at home, this is probably going to be the way that it is. Kilcullen really gets at this when he talks about a lot of the favelas in South America and Central America. He talks a lot about Kingston, Jamaica, and basically how crime syndicates kind of run the area, and how it's not necessarily going to be a counterinsurgency fight, but it's going to be more of like a criminal venture. I read those passages and I think, okay, they're preparing for Detroit, or they're preparing for New York, or something like that. And that's kind of the where my mind tends to go. Now, that observation might spark an idea, and that is that, hey, reading the doctrine of a potential adversary is valuable because it gives you an idea of how they're thinking. But the problem with that is that if you're looking for this book, and if you're expecting this book to provide a model for what, shall I say, domestic operations may look like for the U.S. military or anybody, really, this book doesn't really talk about it so much. This is not a blueprint for anything, and you're not really going to get that much knowledge from it. It's a good idea. It's a good idea, I will say, to read what your leaders are reading. That's why books are put on reading lists, and that's why I have on our reading list an awful lot of books I don't agree with, because you need to be reading the books of the people who are making policies, because if you consume what they are consuming from your prepared citizen perspective, you'll have a better idea as to what they're going to do. However, with this book, it didn't really work out so much, which is why I put it on the list. I was hoping that this would work out a little bit better, but you don't really get a good idea of this because Kilcullen's a very challenging read, and it's hard to kind of cherry pick these little nuggets of wisdom out of there. Wrapping things up with kind of the final ideas of this book, I think the things in this book that are not said at the end are probably more helpful, because this book really kind of pins the tail on the donkey of fourth generation warfare, and the author at the time had no understanding of the concept of fifth generation warfare, but he does talk around it passively almost. It's almost like I can see into the mind of Daniel Abbott, who wrote the handbook of fifth generation warfare, and I can see him reading this book, and I can see him thinking, alright, Kilcullen is getting at something here, but he's grasping at straws, and he's trying to grab smoke out of the air, and a lot of the data that he's seeing doesn't really add up. So maybe, just maybe, we need a new model for thinking about things, because a lot of the time, when we get into the counterinsurgency space, we stretch things beyond the simple, insurgent model. And one of the ways that Kilcullen kind of mentions this, which sets up the fifth generation warfare idea just exquisitely, is one idea: technology, and really social media. So Kilcullen basically wraps the book up and saying, hey, look, social media, Facebook, Twitter, these things are going to be vastly more efficiently used by an insurgent force than, say, an occupying military force. And because of that, we're kind of screwed from a nation-state perspective. So we can see how this is very much the birth of the idea of fifth-generation warfare. How it's not quite, 5GW is not quite insurgency with PSYOP sprinkled over the top. That's not it at all. It's really hard to define. It's like trying to nail Jello to the wall. You can't really define fifth generation warfare. I mean, you can get close, but man, you got to use a lot of words to get there. And in 2024, where no one in America believes anything is real anymore, well, I mean, everybody thinks they're living in a simulation, or it's all, super fake, and everything's just not real, and all information is intended to be consumed or something like that. I can see that he anticipated, and many others anticipated as well, that technology, hey, it's going to be important. I don't think they realize how crippling it's going to be, and how crippling it already is for civilization. It is absurd how much technology and the flow of information has just become absolutely uncontrollable. And these grand campaigns are really everywhere. It's so multi-domained, which is why it's tiring a lot of times, and the situation can seem very, very hopeless a lot of the times when it comes to living here in the United States. These grand information operations, controlling information campaigns, I don't think anyone, even Kilcullen, could have anticipated how crippling it is to the average citizen. Granted, there's some element of, all right, look, PSYOPs are supposed to be, they're not, the goal of the PSYOP is not the continuation of the PSYOP, but in fifth generation warfare it might be. Why are you trying to trick someone? Well, because we're trying to get them to do something or think something. But in our modern times, we step out of the pages of Kilcullen and we realize, wait a minute, why is this military operation ongoing? Well, just for the hell of it, basically. Why is this PSYOP being pushed? Why is this narrative being pushed? Well, just because they can. There's no real end goal for some of it. Now, for a lot of it, it is, and unfortunately, we can't really talk about a lot of that because, well, there's censorship concerns and all that. But when it comes to Out of the Mountains, we realize that this is probably not the best way of thinking of things in terms of strictly counterinsurgency. It's just so hard to define. You have to literally live it, and it's not something that policymakers can understand. Even the title of this book is an extreme case of just palpable irony, because the title of this book is a quote from none other than Osama bin Laden, in which Kilcullen details how bin Laden said, hey, look, now that we've started the war with the West, we need to find our way out of the mountains because they're coming here, and we need to find ways of moving to, bin Laden didn't say this specifically, but the inference is bin Laden was trying to move to cities and move to more population-dense areas because he knew that counterinsurgency tactics would force him out of the mountains. As we all know, the extreme irony of this is bin Laden did move out of the mountains, and he was killed out of the mountains. So if he had stayed in the mountains, maybe things would have been a little bit different. So just a little bit of food for thought that only a couple of years after the publication of this book, yeah, that's right, bin Laden came down out of the mountains, and he was killed there. So Kilcullen tends to lead to a little bit more high-level philosophical thoughts on a lot of what the U.S. military did, because the first reaction that you get if you tell any soldier to read this, or anybody who's not like a field-grade officer and still in the military, I'm sure they would probably agree with most of the stuff in this book. But for the guys who were there in 2003 or 2005 in Iraq, Baghdad, all that kind of stuff, these guys are going to read this book and be very, very angry because to think, and for me, it's a little embarrassing to think that, man, I was part of this machine that believed this, and believed that this was the way forward. And at the time, even in 2015, it was very clear that this was not working out so well. So this is a really good book. If you wanted to read some of the vignettes, if you're looking for a counterinsurgency perspective on a lot of different events, everything from the London riots to Mumbai terrorist attacks, Karachi burning, basically, Nairobi, all kinds of stuff like that is in this book. The conclusions are hard to understand a lot of times. Most of the time I had to kind of read things 5 or 6 times before I understood what Kilcullen was trying to say. But anyway, it's a good book if you want to read that. But like I mentioned, and I don't mean to be overly negative in this by any means. I just think that this book is more of a symbol than anything. So yeah, an interesting conclusion, I think, to read a book from the Petraeus era of Iraq and Afghanistan and think immediately to the future and to how some of the things in this book, a lot of the doctrine didn't play out, a lot of the threats were misinterpreted and things like that, and a lot of times we read stuff like this and we just immediately go to the future and start seeing how this is going to develop. So I'm not saying this book is worthless by any means. I think that it's challenging to read, and I probably wouldn't recommend it for most people, but like I mentioned, it really is a sort of poetic symbol for where the United States has been and where we're going. So, but now that we've read it, I think that we've got a good understanding for some things that probably didn't work out so well. Understanding the model for how nation states can bring conflict to basically just one city, like a Mogadishu kind of situation. That might be helpful for some cities here in the United States, especially for understanding how the U.S. Might react to that sort of thing. But we all know that that's, the solutions and the examples that were cited in this book don't really represent what's going on in America. The culture alone being completely and utterly alien is probably a bigger factor than anything else. But again, not super terrible, not super great. In years past, I've rated this book higher than I think that it should have been. I thought much more highly of Kilcullen and these books than I do today, which I guess is sort of inevitable. But some of you might find it interesting. It's a fairly short read, but it still took me longer than I thought it would to get through it. But I do think that it does set us up more clearly for branching outside of our comfort zones and learning about things that maybe we thought we already knew. I'm sure a lot of people will read this book and recognize things like, for instance, right here in the introduction alone, I was there. I was there in a few of these districts, and it's very interesting to read that sort of thing from a very, very different perspective. So once again, thank you all for sticking with my random collection of thoughts, and I'm glad we got through this one, and we will move on to the next. So thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.